meeting, which is entitled Titan, the Poor Man's Atlas. And my name is Roger Johnson, and I'm the past chairman of the Computer Conservation Society, but it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce firstly David Hartley, who is your current chairman, to my great relief, after 3 years or whatever it was. David is going to, I think, lead off, and then Richard Jennings will follow, and John Buckle has kindly agreed, John sitting there, John has agreed to lead the discussion at the end. Let me start by just briefly introducing David. David spent nearly the whole of his academic life and then his working life at Cambridge University. He did what became the diploma in computer science, and had a name which eludes me again, but at the time he did it was a diploma in numerical analysis and automatic computing at that time, and indeed Richard did the same qualification a few years later. David, of course, then went on to do a PhD on an autocode compiler for EDSAC2, and then joined the computing laboratory, which he ran for many years. The computing service, I'm sorry, the computer before Morris rises up and smites us. Then also became heavily involved in computer provision around the country through his service with the computer board. I think, David, I think there were a few other things at the end, but I think that's probably sufficient introduction. You can augment that at your leisure, if you wish. Can I then turn to Richard Jennings, who, as I said, was also a graduate from that diploma course. He then went on to join ICT and worked on I had a script, sorry, let me pick it up rather than look down at it. The Atlas II supervisor, and then worked on George 3. He took charge of all of the ICL 1900s. Is that software? That was. Oh, right. Okay. Well, now you know how to do it. Yep, first time. The ICL, all of the ICL 1900 series software development, and then had various other management roles. Much of the latter part of his career was in customer service, where he established and managed the UK Diagnostic and Support Centre in 1989, and became the UK Service Quality Manager in 1997, and retired a couple of years after. So can I welcome both David and Richard. David, I think, will lead off, followed by Richard, and then David will make some closing remarks. So David, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to address the Society. I think it's the second time I've done it. Now equal to the number of times I've addressed the Manchester mob. There we are. So that's the title. That actually explains what Titan was in its relation to Atlas. Titan is the name of the prototype Atlas II. Atlas II is the cut-down model of Atlas, or sometimes called Atlas I. And I'll tell you in a moment how it came to being. I'm going to concentrate, of course, therefore, on the Cambridge side of the project, and Richard will add what I call the ICL perspective. But before doing that, I want to give you, very briefly, the history of computing in Cambridge up to that point, because it's relevant to why we did that. Now, that's where we were. Everyone's seen that picture before. The EDSAC. It was the first Cambridge machine. It was the world's first stored program computer to go into regular service, Barking in Manchester, which didn't go into service. Of course, they were 1 year before us, we admit that. It was built in 1946, from 46. It started in service in 1949, and it was dismantled in 1958. Maurice Wilkes, as policy with that computer, immediately it started working. And of course, working was not what we call working nowadays. The machine had to be serviced several hours for every morning. and broke down occasionally. It was said by Eric Much many years later that the number of, during its lifetime, the number of major fires reached double figures. But Morris's policy was to have the thing used. It was set up in a laboratory. It was set up to encourage computation and support computation around the university. And I've seen a copy of a circular which he sent round to all sorts of key professors saying, I have built a calculating machine, please come and use it. And he let research students use it. I mean, almost unheard of those days in many ways, you know, they might get wasted. And throughout its life, one thing it did was it contributed to the award of at least 2 Nobel Prizes. So, you know, he had a useful career. I've said that about Morris yet, but that's of course a more recent one. I don't you all realise he's still alive. He's 94 now, getting a bit bent, but he's very much all there. He goes to work every morning, the lab. Now, this is the basic statistics of EDSAC, and it goes like this. It ran at 300 instructions per second, not MIPS or KIPS, 300 per second, HIPS. It had 2 kilobytes of memory. Hang on, I shouldn't have done that. Spoiled that, hasn't it? I was going to be surprised. 2 kilobytes of memory in motion delay lines. It had no online storage, no tape. That's an experimental tape. And roughly, it had about 50 users at its peak. 50 people all in university who came to use it. And if you compare that to what it replaced, it was 1,500 times more powerful. Because what it replaced was a human being with a hand calculator. And you see that this figure is very significant. That was a big step forward. EDSAC 2 was the second machine, also homemade, started being built in 52, came into service in 58, and was dismantled in 65, for which more about in a moment. It had packaged circuitry, had plug-in units, so if one unit failed, you took it out and put a spare in. They were about that big, but they were. It had a ferrite core memory, which was built in advance. Indeed, they wondered whether they should call it something else, because EDSAC stands for Electronic Delay Line Storage Automatic Computer. This did not have delay line storage. It did have magnetic tape file store. They're sort of hidden behind those people on the right there. And this picture is the job queue. You could test your programs, I think it was 2 or 3 times a day. There's a particular period set aside where you queued up and you were allowed 3 minutes. You fed your paper tape in, you waited for it to assemble, you ran it, the program, you printed your results out on paper tape or whatever, and then you went away. And the operating system that made sure you didn't overrun was called those people standing behind you. And it worked. Whereas for people with longer work to do, there was an evening rota. I can't remember it all offhand, but one night was read astronomy, another night was theoretical chemistry, and Friday night was always crystallography night, and so on. The date of EDSAC is, and the 2 EDSACs, that EDSAC 2 ran at 10,000 instructions per second. It was a microprogrammed machine, it had built-in floating point, and if I rock this, it goes on, never mind. It had online tape store, and its number of users, I have to go back, was in fact 200. Yeah. And that factor over EDSAC was only 40. So you see the law of diminishing returns of computing immediately coming in terms of power. And of course, while you only had one machine, as one did in those days, well, I mean, 40 was a big step forward, but nothing like what you might think it is today, because with so many more computers around the place. But the actual computer itself, not that much more powerful. The EDSAC 2 closure started a Cambridge tradition. In Cambridge, we never opened machines, for very good reasons, because all new machines were suspect and didn't actually work very well, and users hated them. So there was no cause for celebration. But when you closed them down, they got to like it. And indeed, compared with the new machine that was waiting in the next room, this was a cause for emotion. And that's the users crowding in the computer room when Maurice Wilks ran the last program, which had been punched on black paper tape. The program played the last post on the machine. And as I've said many times before, grown men were seen to weep. Ready? So by 1960, halfway through the life of EDSAC-2, Cambridge had started thinking about its third machine. And it did not want to build another machine. It felt it really had to go buy one. And of course it had to be something that was worthwhile having, i.e. significantly more powerful than EDSAC-2. And about that time, the university funding authorities was giving out packets of money to universities to buy computers, and we had got £250,000 to spend. The problem with that was, well, it was in fact just about the price of a KDF-9 apparently. A big hint of what we had to buy. And many universities bought KDF-9s in the 60s. They were fine. But EDSAC-2 was the power of a KDF-9, roughly speaking. There was no point in having one. And so we looked around what was there, and there were only two machines, I believe, I wasn't involved with this, that were worthwhile. One was the Atlas, being built at Manchester, and the other was the IBM 7090, neither of which we could afford. And so we were stumped what to do. And Maurice clearly went round to various people, including up to Ferranti at West Gordon, and talked to Peter Hall. And suddenly, after a meeting there, Peter Hall wrote a letter to Maurice, and I'm going to read you bits of it, you can see it here. Because this was Peter Hall's suggestion for Titan. And I'll read bits out of this. Your computer problem is occupying our mind very much at the moment. I tried to ring you today, but you were away. Perhaps when you've read this letter, you would care to give me a ring. And then he goes on to say, Cambridge and Manchester universities are unique in that they are machine designers and builders. Can we not exploit this at Cambridge? If we sold you, that's we Ferranti, at works cost, in inverted commas, he never defined what works cost was, uncommissioned standard parts of the present Atlas, and a slow store, could you do the necessary connecting together, design of special bits, modifications, etc., and commissioning? In other words, we will sell you large chunks of standard hardware and you do the rest. So, well, we didn't quite what we wanted to do, but of course, being in Cambridge, we were certainly game to do it. We were given half a machine and told to design the rest. Peter goes on, in return, letting you have this hardware at works cost, you would let us have all designs and information on the work you do relating to it, e.g. connecting in the slow store, programming, etc. At a very rough preliminary guess, we would, under this arrangement, let you have the following bits of hardware at, what do we guess, £250,000. And he goes on to say, I must emphasise that these items would be uncommissioned and you would just fit together. So it would not just fit together. We would, of course, send you all information to commission them yourself. You might like someone to come up here during commissioning the earlier machines, and we could probably send a man to work with you in Cambridge. This is just a thought, it's very sketchy, but what do you think? It seems to me that if you have the necessary effort, it would help you and us, because he also says in the letter, I didn't read it out, that this would be then the basis for a second model of Atlas for ICL, for Ferranti to market. And in that letter, that was the configuration he proposed for £250,000. Well, we agreed. It was interesting. I another letter from Maurice to Peter Hall. Well, Peter Hall to Maurice first of all, saying, Peter said, we've been thinking about the name for this machine, and we think we want to call it Atlas 2. And also in the documentation, it's clear that Cambridge meeting would call it EDSAC 3. But it was interesting how diplomatic Maurice was. He agreed to Atlas 2 very quickly. And of course, and Titan as well. Now, the actual initial configuration is given there, and we have the arithmetic logic unit, which was identical to Atlas. Same instruction set, same logic control and everything. And it just was 2 bays of Atlas kit. Was it 2 bays? You know? Chris, no. But it's because Atlas had a very elaborate one-level store. It had page address registers, it had a drum, and it was all automatic with the software that you had this very large virtual memory. So users could spread themselves all over it, the operating system could spread itself all over it, and no one had to worry about the fact the store was only that big, and you thought it was that big. Now, we couldn't have that. That was just far too expensive. But nevertheless, we had to design a system in which we could do multi-programming. We'd have several programs running together. So the machine was given the poor man's paging system, which was 2 registers, one saying where the program started, and one saying how long it was. And that's all we needed. We also redesigned the peripheral controller because, again, Atlas was very complex, had all sorts of peripherals. All we needed to do was control paper tape readers, paper tape punchers and printers, and the magnetic tapes. And so David Wheeler redesigned all that. The magnetic tape controllers was interesting. I'm not sure Rich will say so much later. In that when it read a block of tape, and all tapes were fixed block length, pre-addressed, 512 words, it could scatter a block of tape, block of data coming off the tape into blocklets of information in the memory. So we could put little bits of data, little bit of a corner of the memory, or collect them and put them on the tape. And that was a piece of efficiency. The 1-inch pre-addressed tapes were standard Atlas type tapes. As I said, David Wheeler was the design authority of this machine. He had control over the design, not only Cambridge people, but also Ferranti people. Such was the trust of Ferranti in us. And Roger Needham, who was then just finished his research, helped David by writing a lot of design automation software in EDSAC2. So all the printed circuit boards were laid out in EDSAC2 with code written by Roger. And we had 2 Ferranti engineers seconded to us for installation and commissioning. We got to know them very well. That picture is of a lecture theatre, which we were gutting at the time. It was the old anatomy lecture theatre, big tiered lecture theatre, which they took everything out to make the room for Titan. And so that's the Titan room. And that actually is Eric March, if anyone remembers Eric, where he died in the late 60s. The hardware, the basic hardware was delivered in 1963, and enough was commissioned to enable us to run programs in October 1963. There's a little story I insert about these tape drives. I said there were 6 tape drives. When I finished my research, I went to see Maurice Wilkes and said, any jobs going? I started getting involved with this project, which had started, and I very desperately wanted to stay and work on it. And Maurice said, well, difficult because we're full, we haven't got any vacancies unless somebody dies. But then he thought about it, and apparently when he was pricing up the Titan, he discovered that he could have Titan and 7 tape drives, or have Titan and 6 tape drives and me. That's why it was 6. And Maurice does say to this day, when he remembers, that he thought he made the right choice. I'm told there's a published history of Ferranti, in fact I'm told I've seen the book today, thank you Alan, which claims that this was all done, the Titan, because Cambridge wouldn't agree to have any machine that originated from Manchester. And this is a story from a historian, because that's precisely what Titan was. Machine designed by Manchester, which we're very happy to have. So where he got that from, I don't know. But the Titan operating system had to be different from the Manchester one, because the Manchester system was built on this one-level store, which we didn't have. The Manchester operating system just bunged the input data all over the place, and output data, and forget about it. We had to very carefully buffer stuff to keep the machine busy. Because remember that machines in those days had operating systems not to make it easy for the user to use. It was to optimize the efficiency of the machine, to make sure that the CPU was kept busy and not left waiting for input-output. And that's what the operating systems did in those days. In fact, they made the darn machine very difficult to use for users if they were batch systems. So we had to rebuild, or start again with the operating system, but we used the same process technology that Manchester devised. And that's where we had a joint project. We there were 2 joint projects on this thing with Ferranti, ICL. There was the hardware side, which was with Scorpion, and the software side, which was with people like Richard up in the Hill. Richard will talk more about that later. The Cambridge, now I'm going to see some pictures of Titan, and I'll give some words. The Cambridge team initially consisted of David Barron, myself, and a guy called Barry Landley. And the Bracknell team, the ICL team, consisted of Chris Spooner, I think on his own to start with. But they built it up to quite a big team, and again, Richard's going to talk about that. It was to be a multi-programming operating system, as I've said before. No level 1 level store, no drum. So we designed a magnetic tape, what we call well, place to dump input output, which again Richard's going to talk about. And by late 1984, that's a good year after the machine became available for programming, when the system was supposed to have been completed, it wasn't. Far from it. And we learned, like everyone else learns, that big software projects are always late. And we were no exception. At about that time, though, we made a visit to Manchester, because we'd heard that they also were running late, but they'd been rather clever. They developed a temporary operating system and a temporary, I don't know, autocode compiler or something. And so we went up to see it and talked to the people up there, and we came back fired in the enthusiasm saying, we should do that, because otherwise we shall be in dead trouble with our users. We've got to provide them some sort of service. And so we went to 2 people to commission a temporary supervisor and a temporary compiler. The temporary supervisor written by Peter Swinton Dyer. It was single job processing, no multitasking, and all the buffering was in the memory. I/O went straight into the memory and then into the program. So it was not efficient, but it worked. It was deadly simple and very impressive. Well, at the same time, Maurice Wilkes himself wrote an autocode compiler, copied the EDSAC2 autocode, extended it, which was later written by Peter Swinton Dyer himself. In fact, as the main supervisor project dragged on, Peter said, I think I could write something a bit better than the temporary supervisor, and started designing buffering on the tape. And we said, hang on a minute, if we're not careful, all the software is machine was written by one man. And we couldn't quite stomach that. I think there's a lesson to learn there, though. So we got going faster as a result of that. So the temporary supervisor was operational from 1964, and the main supervisor was scheduled for November 64. It didn't go fully into service until 1966. It was a good 2 years late. That was, of course, politically a problem. Now, the main supervisor, as I said before, was a joint project with ICL. It was a multi-programming job system, like Atlas. No terminals, no interaction, straightforward jobs being put in paper tape readers or card readers, put into the big buffer, brought off and scheduled, running budget. So those multi-programming meant the jobs could overtake each other. Quick jobs could go in with high priority and so on, but very distinctly offline. And in fact, whereas the EDSAC 1 and 2 were machines the users actually ran themselves, they actually pushed the buttons themselves, they didn't touch that machine, they didn't even see it. You had to ask permission to go and see it. And they hung their paper tapes on a peg on the wall, and they got the results back some time later. And that was the dark days of computer use, in my opinion. Right, so, however, that's supposed to represent multiple access, because, and to sort of be the opposite of what I've just said, while the supervisor was still under development, 1965, Maurice Wilkes went off to the States, as he tended to do about once a year, and went to MIT. MIT, he saw the CTSS, compatible time-sharing system, an IBM 7090, which was indeed a time-sharing system. All accessed by terminals, and it was a complete revolution. I mean, no one had ever seen this like it before. It was marvelous, you know. And Maurice came back and said, we've got to do that. No arguments. That's the way of the future. And indeed we agreed that if MIT could do it, so could we. Had a few problems. We had to redirect the project, but fortunately, ICL, because of half the project, were then working on the system that was going to go to Aldermaston. Again, Richard will talk about that. And they were diverted we diverged, and their requirements were different from ours. And so in fact, we were suddenly in 2 separate teams and 2 separate systems. And what we did was as follows. We made some hardware design changes. I said we'd have a base and limit register for the memory relocation and protection. We had a second pair put in. We had 2 place registers and 2 limit registers, which, if you like, is the crudest form of segmentation, if you remember that old world thing, which meant that you could have a user program in memory, of which one bit was the program and one bit was the data. And then if it was a program written carefully, it could run, if you were there, one instance of the program for several users at once, each having their own bits of data. And they could be kept separate from each other. I do wish I wouldn't stop doing that. Never mind, doesn't matter. And this was important when it came to providing time sharing or interaction. We didn't have a drum, as I said, but we got ourselves a disk. In fact, Basil de Ferranti was very generous with Ferranti's money and gave us one. There was some sort of deal which said we sold it back to the Times, but they never claimed it. Ferranti was very good at that. And so we were given the disk. And the third thing we did, we hooked it on like a magnetic tape drive. And we built a multiplexer. David Wheeler designed it to link teletype terminals into the main machine. And we set about turning our multi-programming operating system into a multi-access system. But if you thought about it, if you just simply put users on terminals sitting there all interacting with their programs, the machine would have died from the efficiency point of view, because it had no swapping. You couldn't swap programs in and out onto a disk. You could onto a drum, that was fast enough, but the disk wasn't fast enough. And so we had a very clever device. We sort of fooled users, because we made it so that if you ran something like the editor, the text editor or filing utilities, they were carefully programmed to be using these 2 base and limit registers, so they took up very little memory. And for each extra user, they took up 64 more words of blocklet. And so we could cram users in without any form of swapping into the memory. And when it came to user running his or her own programs, we didn't let the program actually read input from the terminal or write output to the terminal. It read input from files and read output to disk. And as soon as the program had finished running your terminal, it produced the output onto the terminal. So it was interactive job running, or job step running, but you weren't interacting with your own mission, your own program. But that's what most people wanted. We managed to support about 24 simultaneous users on this, with a 48K machine, word machine, and it was really highly successful. We also had to develop a file store for people to hold their programs and data on the disk. That was largely done by Sandy Fraser, who had come to us back from Beans with us to start with as a student, but then he went to ICL and he came back to us. And he designed that, and we put a lot of good user access protection in there. So people could say, yes, I can let my friends read this tape, I can write it, and no one else can read it at all. And we did things like making access dependent not on the person using it, but on what program was using it. So you could have system programs accessing data in the user file space, but the user couldn't access it themselves directly. So we did a lot of pioneering work on accessibility and so on in those days. And finally, what we thought was a rather small thing was passwords. Because in those days, you had passwords, you kept them in a file somewhere, and you blocked the file so people couldn't read it. But if people could read the file, they could get the passwords. Roger Needham had a bright idea one day. He invented an algorithm for scrambling passwords, which was a one-way algorithm. There was no unscrambling algorithm. And that meant that even if a hacker got at the file and saw the scrambled passwords, they couldn't unscramble them. And of course, most systems now use that today. And that was invented by Roger. Anyway, this new system, it was a tribute, in fact, I think, to the basic design of the Titan system and the Atlas system too. We were able to bolt on or to develop the old system into, and it's quite easy. And it went operational in 1967, March, and it went operational 24/7 immediately, and was a great success. And it saved, I think, our reputation in Cambridge and all that. I'm going to move this one on. Oh, it's okay. Robin will not recognise that. I'll tell you what it is in a moment. I want to say something about what the machine was used for. Well, it was a university computing service machine, so it was used for everything. It was used by scientists, by non-scientists, it was used by students, We had the capacity in that machine to let undergraduates use it. We taught large classes on it. And in particular, the laboratory started to pioneer new forms of application because it was there. And the one I want to refer to is computer-aided design. We built a computer-aided design team. We linked a PDP-7 to the Titan. And the PDP-7 did the graphics. So we had nice interactive graphics back-ended by Titan. And that was a phone cutting machine online. I presume it was online till 7, wasn't it, Robin? But it doesn't actually matter. But it was a way of, that was a mechanical jig for cutting profiles. And we're talking here about the early 70s, I think, late 60s. So Titan became our workhorse in Cambridge. Here's the basic data again. It was a quarter of a MIP. It was getting quite fast. You must realize in those days that was fast. Didn't now, but in those days it was fast. And 3/4 of a meg, 128 megabytes of file store, and I think that says 800 users. It really was serving a very big population, but it was only 25 times faster than ENSAC 2 in power, which again just shows this law of diminishing returns. Now, slight diversion from operating systems. It's amazing to think that in those days, when you had new computers, we automatically said, right, therefore we have a new programming language. And somehow programming languages were specific to a computer. Mercury had Mercury autocode, Atlas had Atlas autocode, and so on. Fortran was thought to be an IBM thing, because Fortran did become machine independent, and was machine independent. So we said, right, at the same time as having a project to design a new operating system, we had a project to design a new language. And that was the days of Algol 60, and of course we wanted to do better. And we designed a program called CPL, a language called CPL, which originally stood for Cambridge Programming Language. We then had the bright idea of saying, let it be an Atlas language, Atlas 1 and 2. So we went to Manchester and said, how about joining this project? And they said, sod off, we're doing Atlas autocode. Fair enough, they got started. Went to London University, went to Atlas, and they said, hey, yes, let's do it. So with Eric Nixon and John Buxton, who joined the team from London, we swiftly called the language the combined programming language. Later on, as a jest, it was then called Christopher's private language, because we were joined by Christopher Strachey, who came to Cambridge first as a consultant and then as a research fellow. And he took the project over and did a lot of very important pioneering theoretical work on languages. But the trouble was, we didn't want a theoretical language, we wanted something to use. And in fact, it shows how arrogant we were in those days. We produced a circular to our users in the days before Titan was working about what Titan was going to be like. And we said, you're going to have this language called CPL, and it's going to be suitable for all applications, scientific, non-scientific, everything. And it's going to be so good that you won't need to use assembly language. In fact, you won't be allowed to use assembly language, we said. Well, CPL never made it. It never got finished. The compiler at London got finished, but we never finished it. I'll tell you why in a moment. But the embarrassing times in user group meetings when Paul Morris Wilkes would stand up in front of them and meet later, and they'd bring out these tattered old copies of this memo and say, you said. And in fact, we wrote a Fortran compiler rather quickly afterwards. But where CPL went was that there was a bright young research student on the team called Martin Richards, who went off to MIT for a period, and while he was there, I really thought it was better to do this away from Cambridge. He took CPL, which was a very complex language. It had all sorts of types, like IO68, everything was a type. Data, program, everything. And he stripped out all the types and said, I'm going to have one type called a half word, because he wanted to write a language for system programming. And he called it Basic CPL, BCPL, which of course, as people know about that. And then, as I'm told, people at Bell Labs in the States saw BCPL and said, I don't like that, and designed something called B. And then they put the types back and called it C. So some of us are the authors of the great-grandfather of C. But I have to mention CPL rather carefully, particularly Morris Wilkes' company, because to him, and he was quite right, it was a failure. Because in those days in Cambridge, we built things to run, to use. We didn't build them to admire them or say how marvellous they were. And this didn't make it. Great pity. Anyway, Titan lived on until 1973, when it was closed down and replaced by an IBM 370-165. But what happened in Cambridge then is another story, not for today. But we continued the tradition of closed down ceremonies. And by then, Titan was in another building, and I always come later. And we assembled the users in a 500-seat lecture theatre, because we had to have something that big to get them all in. We video projected, transmitted the pictures of the Titan with all sorts of cameras around it, being closed down. And it was all very dramatic, and talks were given, and then they saw on a big screen, first of all, the operators come and type on the operator terminal, closed down, and then the chief systems guy came and shut the system down, and then the engineers came in and switched off the peripherals one by one, and for effect, they turned the lights off one by one. And then finally, the chief engineer came in, and he went to the big panel on the wall with a big power switch, put his hand on it, and the camera zoomed in, so all you could see was this big, big switch and his hand, and he turned it, and he went round and round and round and round and round. The person whose name I'm going to mention in a moment was the research student who did it. Now, there are other Atlas II computers. One went to Alder Mousen, which Richard's going to talk about. They didn't really want an Atlas II, but they got one. The government wanted them to buy British. It's a novelty. And the second other one went to CAD Centre. In fact, CAD Centre was created in Cambridge to house this stock machine that ICL had built to sell to someone. They never otherwise sold any Atlas IIs, except those two places. But what was interesting was that the CAD Centre was set up to do CAD, built on the CAD work that we did in Cambridge. And so they used our operating system, not ICL's, the Cambridge system. And when we, partway through the life of Titan, moved it from one building to another, it was thought, that's it being shoved out the door, actually, it would take 3 months to recommission it. We've done good things in those days. It didn't take 3 months, it took more like a month, but we planned for 3 months. And the Atlas II at the CAD Centre up the road in Cambridge had just been commissioned. And so we arranged that we would have the machine for the university for those 3 months. And we transferred the workload by what today would seem obvious, but it was a miracle in those days. We took all the dump tapes. The system had a very big incremental dumping system for all the files. We took them off Titan and took them to Atlas II in CAD Centre and mounted them. And then we said to load the operating system and said, pretend you've lost the master directory. So reload the system. And it did, and it worked. And we said to the post office, it was the post office in those days, reconnect all the lines we've got around Cambridge from the lab to by the afternoon, the system was up and running. And so we transferred the whole thing within a day, which is remarkable. So there we are. I think, no, I've got a bit more here. What did we expect to achieve and what did we achieve? Well, we got a big enough third computer for our funds, no doubt about that. We pioneered operating systems with ICL, and time sharing, CAD, and we create an optimal balance between efficiency and utility. It was easy to use, it was online, but the system was kept very busy. And supporting 800 users on a machine like that was crazy if you think about it today. The system influenced our later IBM mainframes. In fact, we made a lot of changes to the IBM system. It looked very Titan-like before it fully finished, but it was still compatible with IBM architecture. And the creators of Unix were ex-Titan users, at least some of them were. Steve Bourne wrote some of the utilities for Titan, went off to the States, and worked at Bell Labs on Unix, and everyone knows Steve Bourne. He was the guy who fixed that switch, I think. So who was who, just to summarise, and this is mainly from the Cambridge team, of course. Well, I start with Peter Hall, because it was his idea. It wasn't Cambridge's idea, it was Peter Hall's idea, and I pay tribute to Peter for that. And it was Maurice Wilkes who accepted it with alacrity, and they should have credited with that. David Wheeler, who designed and redesigned the hardware, and Neil Wiseman, who helped him do it, he was the chief engineer. And it's sad, isn't it? Only one of those are still alive. Late Billy Elliott came to Cambridge for a few years to be the project manager to help do all the negotiations and so on for bits of hardware. And Peter Swinton Dyer, who nearly developed all the software single-handed. Peter was he's a brilliant programmer, but he's gone back to being a mathematician. And he would have the ability to think of a compiler, and he would write out the compiler, the code in longhand. And he'd say to a few people, does that look right? The whole compiler. And then he'd have it punched up and run. So the idea of structured programming was not necessary. The structure was in there in his head. Marvellous man, Peter. David Barron, who led the Cambridge side, and Chris Spooner, who led the ICL side. And then Roger Needham, who took over the operating system when David left Cambridge, and the team there was myself, Ferranti, Mike Guy, Sandy Fraser, and a few research students, including Steve Warren. So, I hand over to Richard.
Right. Okay, thank you, David. Right, I joined this project in 1963 at the end of doing the diploma course. Decided I didn't really want to work for ICT, and certainly not for Elliot's, both of whom I worked for during my summer vacation. So I joined Ferranti, which I had also worked for and rather enjoyed. So I'm not the only one with David's not the only one with an original Ferranti letter. Mine said, dear sir, with a reference to your recent interview, we are pleased to offer you at a weekly salary of £20 to be paid on a monthly basis. I thought, you must have computers to do that sort of thing. Anyway, I joined this small team. That's really from my recollection as to who was in it at the time. Chris leading it, Tom Wansborough, Philip Brennan, who was the king of the well, which I'll talk about later. Mike Don-Soper was after Trice, was doing some programming on mag tape, as I recall, and me reporting through Hugh Devonald to Peter Hunt, who at that time was running the computer labs at Lily Hill House, Bracknell, and later became head of all software development after the takeover merger with ICT. Now, it was a fairly relaxed period, as I recall, in those early months. We didn't have the AWRE order. I don't recall any great discussions of deadlines, although presumably Cambridge had some at the time. And we had...
Long past.
And we were still in the design stage, and we had a number of meetings between David Barron, Roger Needham, David Hartley, for example, and from our side, Chris Spooner, Tom Wansborough and myself. That sort of typical half-dozen meeting. We'd go up to them sometimes and have a pleasant lunch at the Plough at Fenditton, or they'd come down to us and have a pleasant lunch at the Three-Legged Cross at Warfield. It's all right, pleasant, really. Then we actually managed to sell our Atlas II to Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at Aldermaston. And then things got a bit more difficult. We ran into a rapid growth of the team. We had firm dates to aim for, and we started to look like a big project. This is the situation in October 1964, about a month after we got, a year after we got the order, where we had a proper management set up and proper teams, and we ran to well, I don't appear on that because I was a humble programmer working for Tom Wansborough. It was I think the last job where I was officially called a programmer. Not as I had stopped me programming latterly, still do. But a team of 28 was quite sizable for the time, I would imagine. And it was really without any of the controls and techniques and so on that we all know now about managing large teams. It sort of happened. It was very much a non-ideal situation from a management point of view. Here we've got this big project, 28 people based in Lilyhill, Bracknell, no hardware there at all, probably none that we could run. We had the machine in Cambridge, and obviously we had university people in Cambridge as part of the team as well. So lots of discussions, either between us in Bracknell and them in Cambridge, or between our people in Bracknell and our people who were testing in Cambridge. And my recollection in those early days is, if you wanted to talk to Cambridge, you buzz the phone, and the switchboard operator downstairs in this sort of mahogany switchboard under the stairs at the hill would phone up the operator, no trunk dialing in those days, and would manage to get a line through to Cambridge. And if anyone else wanted to talk to Cambridge, they had to wait for that call to be finished and the call to be transferred to them. I don't know how many outside lines we had at Lilyhill, but we were only allowed one line to be used for a call to Cambridge. It brings home to you just how primitive some of the other bits of the infrastructure were in those days. So, we started testing in Cambridge. David and I worked on editing and assembly routines, and I certainly remember I adapted, I think, between us we did the Peter Swinton Dyer's assembly, Titan assembly routine, so it talked to mag tapes, and so that we could do assembly from routines held on tape. And I do remember that it was completely, perfectly handwritten with about 2 corrections along the way. Oh yes, this instruction should be added there, and that changed to 0 to a 1 there. And it was absolutely incredible. So, one of my jobs actually was to book the hotel rooms. If we're going to get 28 people all coming up to Cambridge, a few at a time, quite a logistical problem. And throughout 1964, I guess, or 64, 65, there was a year when we had 6 hotel rooms per night booked for programmes coming up there. Mostly at the Royal Hotel, which, because it was undergoing refurbishment at the time, didn't look terribly good, and they were glad of the business. And I seem to remember that their switchboard operator got engaged to the Ferranti mag-tape engineer at the time. There were a few connections there. And so we started testing there. Quite a lot of it at night, because you could have oodles of time at night. So people used to struggle home to the Royal Hotel in the early hours, have a few hours sleep, and then get up just in time for breakfast. Breakfast finished, get on 9:30. So this flood of ICT programs would appear in the dining room of the hotel at 9:28. And one of the waiters, a bit sort of Manuel type character from 40 Towers, threw a wobbly one morning because he was convinced we were doing this to be deliberately awkward to him, and we had to take him on one side and explain that these people were working hard every night. This thing called a computer. And he was okay after that. So, what I want to do now is just talk about one of the main differences between the supervisor the differences between Cambridge and Aldermartin. It was a feature of the supervisor that wasn't in the end used in Cambridge because they went on to time sharing their disk. But this was the tape well, and it was quite a remarkable system. The idea was that as I guess with many machines at that time, if you've got lots of input coming in from tape readers and card readers, and lots of output going out to tape punches and card punches and printers, then needs to be buffered to mag tape. Fine, you have a tape, and basically you have a coarse little buffer, and stuff comes in and goes out from there to various peripheral devices, and you buffer it to mag tape. And basically, you as you run up the tape, You write blocks of data, blocklets formed into blocks, as David was saying, and then you turn the tape round. You can read backwards on these tapes, and you read off bits that have become needed by peripherals or programs running or whatever, and then you turn round and you put another batch of data up there, and then this is the swinging tape, writing stuff from the core store buffer, reading back into core what you need, and as you continually read backwards, you get to a point where you've actually read all the stuff at the bottom, and so that the area of tape that it swings round gradually moves up the tape. The problem with that is that while you're reading backwards, you can't actually write. So while you're reading backwards, all this stuff coming in clogs up the store there. And there's some interesting calculations on this paper from Baron, Spooner and Hartley, I think it was, which said that if they were assuming a well capacity of about 800,000 characters at about 3,000 characters per second coming in. During the main swing of the tape here, about 30 seconds, you have to provide core bufferage of the order of 200,000 characters, which requires about 25k words of core store, an inconveniently large amount. This is something that's very puzzling today, that 200k bytes should be an inconveniently large amount. I mean, it's a couple of photos from that, really. But that was the technology of the time. Core store was expensive, it was in short supply, and there are still those of us in our programming who still try to minimise use of core store because it just comes naturally. So the answer is that you need a subsidiary tape, whereas that has a swing time of say 30 seconds, this one has a swing time of 5 seconds. Again, writing backwards, reading, the same principle as this, so that there are only a few seconds at a time to be kept in the core buffer. And even if you've got a large amount of input coming in, then you can put a feeder tape which just rattles around from a fixed baseline, doesn't swing up like these, and divert into the feeder while this is reading. And similarly, you can put a feeder in here so that you've got an extra buffer. So basically you have 2 swinging tapes, one long swing, one short swing, and 2 feeder tapes running back to a fixed baseline. And that's the 4-tape well. And when that's running, and I saw this during the acceptance trials at Ordermaster, it's almost balletic, really. It's a ballet. You've got all these nasty, noisy, rattling card and tape equipment, and there's this sort of quiet turning of tapes all going on, magically dealing with this vast input, and quite soporific in some ways. But it did work on the sort of workload, predominantly scientific Fortran programs.
So did you read the users' programs in backwards then?
Did you
read the users' programs in backwards?
No, you could read if you've got a block of data, you could read it backwards, going back down the tape, but in store it would appear.
This is just the I/O buffer information. The user's own tapes for this convention.
Oh yes,
yeah.
But it seems to me that you're taking the data in, writing it onto tape, so you've got a tiny process doing that.
Yeah.
You can then subsequently suck it into a bigger program, which is going to use this in its calculation. Or have I got the wrong?
Well, while you may read the blocks backwards, what you're doing is assembling a document which is the document that the...
Yes, but if the program was written on the assumption you started at the beginning of the document, you'd only get the bit you wanted to start with last.
No, you get the whole document down. These are not very big documents.
Right.
They're not very big documents. It's very easy to think in modern terms about huge, great databases. These, I forget, there was a limit of somewhere in this paper of the maximum size of a document, but they're not that large, actually. We also had a tape for the, as I recall, I haven't been able to confirm this anyway, for the supervisor itself, because that had to be buffered or paged out effectively, so that do we call them chapters of the supervisor?
Well, the routines are called SER.
It was SER, yeah. I may be thinking of a different operating system, actually. The various routines of the supervisor were held on tape, and very frequently used routines, which you couldn't be held in store all the time because the core store was too small for that, but they'd be held at frequent intervals up the tape. And the less frequently used ones would be less frequently used on the tape. So that trying to make best use of tape as a sort of random access store, so that you could get to the things you want most often, most quickly. Fascinating system.
Imagine we got our disk. Imagine we got our disk, we threw it all away.
We had a disk at Aldermaston. It was not part of the supervisor. We allowed programs to use it. It was a very small, slow thing that none of us really had anything to do with. And it was right at the end of this long, narrow computer room at Aldermaston. No one sort of ever saw it. We occasionally went down just to see if it was still there, but it was not...
Can I tell about the brief bit of story? When they closed that machine down, I tried to buy that disk. A long time, and they said we'll have to strip the oxide off first.
Right. Well, this is the one photo I have of Aldermaston. It's courtesy of the BBC website. Aldermaston is not the sort of place in those days that you could go around taking photographs of. I did actually take a camera there once, but not to take into Aldermaston. I towed my car over on the way home the previous night, and I thought I'd get a lift with someone into Aldermaston. I thought I could take a photograph of it on the way in, which I didn't manage to do because the camera had actually removed it by the time I got there. I then arrived at Aldermaston with a camera, which had to be deposited with security. But anyway, that's quite a good photograph, really. It shows the sort of general attractiveness of the place. Barbed wire all the way around. You get your car searched at random on the way out, just in case you've hidden an H-bomb in the boot. And these brilliantly built, designed 1950s architecture building. And of course, everyone going on site had to be positively vetted. Which meant doing the whole team, and not everyone passed the positive vetting. I remember one of the senior people in the team telling Chris Spooner, Chris, you do realise I'm not going to get through here, I'm not going to be able to go on site. I don't know why it was, and he never told us, and in the 1960s you didn't ask people that sort of thing. But anyway, for one reason or another, several people were not allowed on site. Which made it very difficult. If you've got two parts of the supervisor which talk to each other, and the authors of those two parts, the programmers, are not allowed to test them, and someone else has to do that, it's a bit difficult. We had one case where on one side, the British chap, I think, who wasn't allowed to go in, and there was a young South African in the team who had the other half of the software, and he wasn't allowed to go in. And we were struggling with other people trying to make sense of the interfaces between two bits of software that they hadn't written themselves. And we persuaded AWRE in the end, if they wanted a working supervisor, that one of those two had to come through. And in the end, the young South African was allowed to come in, provided he had an escort of an MOD policeman So he used to arrive a little bit early, everybody please, to accompany him in. Very, very difficult. We got through to the acceptance trials in early 1966 in the end. It was supposed to be 95. I can remember Peter Hunt leaning on one of the Alex printers and watching yet another dump or post-mortem or whatever we call it there to come out, thinking, and saying, why on earth did we get into this project? It was just soaking up resources that he really wanted to put onto 1900, because that was then starting to come through. Anyway, we got to the acceptance trials. We thought it was all right, and all these jobs appeared from AWRE to run on the acceptance trial. And we found that one particular type of job triggered a bug in the supervisor that we hadn't envisaged before. It was some circumstance that we hadn't come across in testing. You know how it is. But about 1 in 4 of the trial program did actually hit this. And we could see what the problem was, and we could see how to fix it. But we needed to act quickly, because the trial had ground to a halt. And I think if we'd stuck there for another hour, they'd have abandoned the trial, and we'd been back in renegotiating time and keeping this team of 28 going and so on. So I finished up putting an untested patch in. No one else dared do it. I don't know how to do it. We put this untested patch in, and it worked. But that was a very, very difficult trial. So we got through, and I escaped to George III. As David has said, the third Atlas went to the CAD Centre. There was another Atlas, however, another machine called Atlas 10 that ICL many years later produced. Well, they didn't actually produce it, it was a rebadged RCA machine, so it's called. Was it?
Yeah.
Oh, was it? Oh, right. Anyway, it had one thing in common with Atlas 1 and Atlas 2, and that is it was only sold to 3 customers. Right. Oh, I've got the chart, you're right, yes. The Atomic Weapons Establishment, or AWE as they now call, are a bit more forthcoming about information about their history than was published at the time. And they've got this rather interesting document on their website with this chart of what they started with. Ferranti Mark I use, 2 IBM machines, and then they got the stretch, which was a bit of a disappointment. The document says, expectations were high with the installation of the stretch system in 1962, but these were dented when it was discovered that the machine was not as fast as originally promised. It also came without a Fortran compiler. So they were therefore in the market for more power, and probably they would have liked another stretch, but as David said, they were persuaded to turn to Atlas 2, I should say, and then went back to IBM and Cray and who knows what was another. For those of you who prefer the figures, those the relative operations per second. I don't know how it compares with some of yours. In fact, the stretch was replaced in 71 by the 360-75, and Atlas 2 was replaced in 72 by a 370-165. So both machines were replaced by a 370-165. Okay, that's the ICL story, except for.
Right, this is a sort of and finally bit. I said at the beginning of my talk that EDSAC had helped the winning of 2 Nobel Prizes. Now Titan, or Atlas 2, was involved in the Nobel Prize as well, but not quite in the same way. And this is going to perhaps surprise you. That's John Coetzee, an author. He won the Booker Prize twice, in 83 and 99, and then the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2003. So what's this got to do with Atlas II? He came from South Africa in the early 60s as a budding poet. He had to have a job, so he joined IBM in Newman Street. He did not enjoy it, so he left. But the Home Office said he had to have a job, otherwise he had to go back to South Africa. So he joined ICL. Now, how do I know all this? Because it's in his autobiography called Youth, which I recommend. It's an interesting book. It's written in third person, it's not strange. And what I want to do now is quote from Youth things to do with Atlas, because they're quite fascinating. Working for International Computers is quite unlike working for IBM. He can pack his suit away. When he says he means himself, right? Atlas was to strike a blow for the British computer industry from which IBM will take years to recover. What was special about Atlas is that it has a self-consciousness of a mind. At regular intervals it interrogates itself, asks itself what tasks it's performing, and whether it's performing them with optimal efficiency. And then he refers to himself here. His task is to write a routine to follow at the end of each swing of the magnetic tape. Should it read another swing of tape, or should it break off and read a punch card? Should it write some output to another tape, or should it do a burst of computing? Now this is a guy who he'd been on that team with Richard, but gone away from computing, not in computing for what, 40 years? I don't know, a long time, and got a Nobel Prize. But this is his memories, which are interesting. More quotes. The people with whom he works are more interesting than the people at IBM. More lively and perhaps clever too. Everything that is truly novel about Atlas comes not from International Computers, but from a handful of mathematicians at Cambridge. This is a very Cambridge-centric set of quotes. He was permitted to address by first name men with doctorates in mathematics. Men who, once they've got talking, leave him dizzied in their wake. Then he is in Cambridge, on the premises of an ancient university, hobnobbing with the great. He even has a key to the mathematical laboratory, a key to the side door to let himself in or out. One of these days, quite soon, his tasks will be done. He will have to give back his key, the visits to Cambridge will cease, but at least he will enjoy them while he can. So that's interesting. I mean, there's one or two more gems in the back of this book I recommend to you, to help you find a totally different perspective to the history of Atlas II. So I want now just to finish with another few more pictures to pay tribute to one or two special people. David Wheeler, hardware designer of the Atlas II, of the Titan, remarkable man. Equally, Roger Needham, who led the software team in Cambridge. And finally, this bunch of people were the technicians who maintained our Titan. Most of them had maintained EDSAC-2 as well, and they're all still alive. And there they were at the EDSAC 50th anniversary celebration, being acknowledged by the assembled company. And they were very important people. They kept the darn thing running. So, I want to finish with this quotation from Roger Needham. With typical Roger, he gave it again at the EDSAC 50th anniversary, talking about Titan. It was fun. If you're in our trade, nothing gives you a charge like having put together a system which no one else can match. So there we are. Thank you very much. I'll turn this off.
It's on. Yes, it is on. Very interesting talk, I'm sure you all agree, and I hope you've got some questions to ask. I'll throw it open to the floor in a moment, and I'm going to ask you to, before you state your question, to give your name and provenance. So I guess I better give mine to start with. I'm an unreconstructed Ferranti Atlas I person, so that puts me somewhat in the picture. Titan was only in my peripheral vision, I must say. But the other side of it is that Cambridge was my university, so I'm suitably neutral to actually sit in this position. So, can I open it to the floor? Anybody like to ask a question? Hands up, please. Sir.
John, like yourself, I'm also an Atlas I man. I'm in Dick Leatherdale. I worked for some years on the London University Atlas I. There was a story that circulated there, and Richard might be able to tell us whether this is true or not. I never found out. But the Atlas II at Aldermaston and the IBM Stretch were both in the same building, in a long sort of shed-like building. And at the request of both companies, the doors were at opposite ends of this shed, so that the engineers had no social contact with each other. Furthermore, that on one occasion the ICT engineers were found in the IBM room, having locked themselves into their room and crawled through the false floor into the IBM Stretch. Is that true, Richard? Couldn't possibly be true.
Well, I haven't heard that one, but I mean, yeah, I wouldn't put anything past computer engineers. They were in, one was in the West computer room and one was in the East computer room. I can't remember which way. It was in the same building as far as I know. There were some doors, as I recall, in the middle of this long room. I mean, we came in at the sort of southeast corner.
You've gone very faint.
If I think we came in at the southeast corner of our room, and the doors were halfway along the west side. And then presumably there was another room, but we never went in there, unlike the engineers.
Thank you.
Another question?
Simon Lavington, research student on Manchester Atlas. Am I right in saying that you didn't have a separate B store, B lines? There was some talk of an experimental tunnel diode store.
We did have B lines, and they were that was a part of the identical part of Atlas. Remember, Atlas had 128 index registers and B lines, and so that was the same. We had an experimental tunnel diode store because Neil Wiseman, who I mentioned up there, was the chief engineer, and that was his research. And he built two stores, a slave store for slaving instructions, and a small, what we call operand store. The first 8 words, I think, of the user's space were actually in the tunnel diode store. Now, I think the slave store was eventually switched off because it was just too troublesome. But I think so we did have tunnel diodes, but they didn't really work very well.
Next.
David Holdsworth, ex-Leeds University. Do you still have the software in any form where you might try and build an emulation of either Atlas 1, 2, but not 10?
Atlas 10 was an IBM book-alike. You asked me that earlier, and I don't know the answer, but I will go find out.
I just wonder if someone else in the room might be able to inject for it.
But I mean, if we do have it in Cambridge, I know who will have it, or will know where it is. I don't know, I see. No idea. But there's a chance. Of course, the machine itself was thrown away, as we always do throw away machines in Cambridge, but various bits have been kept. The discs make very good coffee tables. But the software, we certainly have the printouts, I'm sure of that.
Well, that'll do.
Are you prepared to key it all in, are you? Oh, right. I'm pretty certain we've got the printouts.
Yeah, I think I know somebody whose OCR is good enough to make use of it.
All right. I will talk to the person, the chief systems guy.
I was involved with a somewhat similar system on KDF9, and we wrote software, and it was put in Leeds University's library for safekeeping. Unfortunately, that safekeeping wasn't quite safe enough, nobody can find it now. But a listing of the director program, the sort of kernel supervisor, somehow found its way into the possession of Hans Spoufal in France. And Hans has actually written a simulator for the KDF9 order code, and he's managed to use OCR plus some manual titivating them to get the source code from the listing back into something that will work. And so if you can do it for that, you may well be able to do it for your stuff. And you may have a complete set of software instead of just part of it.
Well, I know the computer laboratory in Cambridge has a big storeroom full of all sorts of things which I've been through, and I suspect I know where it is, but I will go and talk, and I'll let you know. No promises.
Do you want to say anything about your emulator?
Part of the answer to your question, David, is that the Atlas I fixed store, almost all of it, is in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, as is the Able compiler, the assembler, and the Able runtime library. And I have copies of the first two of those.
Rumour has it the magnetic tapes are in Frank Sumner's loft.
My cellar, actually.
That you got them now, Chris.
Alleged.
Sorry, you said they're dead?
Alleged.
Allegedly.
He has a tape which may or may not contain them.
But it's unreadable.
So I think the idea of getting some of this 1960s, 70s software and actually being able to recreate the environment in which it's executed is quite a valuable historical exercise. And if we don't do it fairly soon, we've done it for George III, then these other things will drift into nothingness. And it's quite stunning to discover how difficult computing was when you actually run George III. But general restores are pretty fast when you're running a PC.
More questions? No.
At a technical level, Simon's asked a question about the B store. Was there on Titan a V store?
Yes.
In the same way, and was there a fixed store?
Yes. There was a small bootstrap store of about 10 instructions, which was a fixed store, which bootstrapped in paper tape. I was trying to understand that bootstrap program, which David Ringler wrote.
What the paper tape loop?
Yeah. Well, not the loop, but what already did. Already did.
No, the loop. I remember I had the great task of taking a David Wheeler paper tape bootstrap loop, changing it to bring it in from paper tape.
All right.
Bloody difficult it was.
Well, David Wheeler's programs were really obscure. But so we didn't really have a fixed store. I don't like Atlas did. But all the peripherals were controlled. All the peripherals looked like a V store. They just looked like another store, and that's how you control peripherals by writing to that store. So
How did extra codes work in that basis?
the extra codes are all soft.
Yeah.
They're all in software.
And they were loaded as core store.
Yeah, or they could be paged in off the tape, as I say, as Richard said, but they're mainly in the store.
Gotcha.
In fact, there's an awful lot that was identical to Atlas, really. It's just the operating system had to be re-engineered. It essentially performed lots of the same functions. And of course, memory management was totally
My name's Clive Page. In 1968 I became a research student in Cambridge and made a fair bit of use of Titan. Normally we were only allowed to submit batch jobs, but I seem to remember at some time of night, maybe it was after 10 o'clock at night, we were allowed to use the interactive terminals. And one of the things I vaguely remember is that there was a primitive form of electronic mail. We used to be able to leave a message for somebody who we thought was going to come in at 1 o'clock in the morning or whenever to do some more programming. And there was also an interactive language called, I think, Figaro.
Yes.
I remember a sort of primitive basic, which we used.
Yeah,
Do you know who did those? Do you remember anything about them?
I remember what you're talking about. I'm trying to rig in my brains as to who wrote them. You remember the game called Moo as well? Yes, that was the famous one.
Yes.
We had a typical interactive program for guessing a series of numbers, and it told you how right you were or how wrong you were, and you had to give another guess and so on.
Yes.
And that's one of the very earliest computer games. Figaro, yes, was really a copy of was it Basic or whatever came out of the system in New Hampshire. Dartmouth. Basic. It was a little basic.
The electronic mail, I don't quite remember what it did.
Well, it wasn't a mail so much; it was a message system.
Maybe you just wrote a file and somebody he discovered it, but I thought it was clearer than that.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's a shocking story about that, which I would dare to tell. When you logged in, and there's a message had been sent to you since you last logged in. As you logged in, it said ***** message for you, right? And then you said mail or something, and it gave you the message. One day, Maurice Wilkes had a visitor. In fact, he had two visitors. One was Sir James Lighthill, who had with him a Russian academician who was showing around Cambridge. I was present at this meeting, and Maurice started to say, "Oh, I must show you the system we've got here." And this is the Titan. So he went over to the teletype in his corner of his office and logged on, and it said ****, message for you. And he obviously hadn't logged on for some time. And so he said, oh, I can show you another feature, this mail system. So he typed message, or mail, whatever it was, and it said P blank SS blank FF. except the vowels were there. And it was signed by the Part 2 physics class. Were you a physicist?
Yes.
I at that time was director of the computing service, and so I thought it my duty to grab the bit of paper on the teletype, tear it off and said, I will deal with that, and hope that the Russian academician hadn't seen it. James Lytle was beside himself with laughter. But it was an amusing incident.
Perhaps the first spam you might almost say.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. We did have problems with hackers, a little, but not much. The hacker problem became prevalent much later on the IBM mainframes, where people did naughty things, and we called them, we did naughty things to them. You weren't one of those, were you? No. I occasionally meet them. They say, you find me.
More.
Another thing that may be apocryphal, I had a friend who read chemistry at Cambridge in about 1966, and he told me of an Atlas simulator, which presumably ran on the teletype. I don't think he logged into this thing and it said, Atlas simulator, Atlas full, no slots available, or something like that. That's the only thing it ever did. Is this true?
I can imagine it's true, because the number of people who could log in at once was limited to about 20, 25 or something. And yes, so when it was full, that's the message you get. And often, peak times of the day, it got very frustrating, because you get something like bashing character return. You get this message, bashing character return. And yes, I'm sure someone did then capture a terminal or a program running on the terminal. But it was difficult to do that, because as I said in my talk, unless you were privileged, and some users were privileged, you couldn't write programs that talked directly to the terminal. So spamming like that was very difficult to do. And I also, you prompted to say two other things about the Titan system in Cambridge. One was that it was extremely, the first thing is to say that we discovered incremental updating. We had the software tools, so whenever we wanted to put a patch in, it went in on the fly. And after a certain time, we never had a new mark of the system. Because when you have new marks, you accumulate changes, and of course you then go backwards because you've introduced so many new errors. But we had this sort of technology that whenever we wanted to make an addition or change a bug, we just did it on the fly. We could back off it very quickly, but backing off one change is no big deal. And so for many of the last 30 years of Titan, it became extremely reliable. And at the same time, if ever we found a loophole in the security system, we always closed it as a matter of principle. So towards the end of his life, it was pretty secure. Downside more secure than any system I've ever seen since then. What were we going to say? Until one day, I became aware of a problem. The mathematics faculty had been using Titan to process the examination results of the maths tripos, which is dodgy in a way. I mean, that's could be subject to attack. But we said to them, look, it's your responsibility. And they said, no, we're confident. We're confident in you and that. But the results got pre-published. And all hell broke loose. And we said, well, not our fault, Charles. And then shortly after that, I had a knock on my door, and a young man, a research student, mathematics, came to see me and said, I think I ought to tell you that. I did not do that, but I have found 6 loopholes in the system. And I had my systems people with me at the time, and I said, well, tell us about them. And he told us about them. The jaws of my systems guy dropped with the ingenuity of this guy. And I believed him, he hadn't caught it, the thing. So I admonished him. I said, look, you've done the right thing. If ever you find loopholes again, it's your duty to tell us straight away. And then I said to my other 2 staff, would you just leave us? And I asked the bloke to stay behind, and I offered him a job. And he still works for goodness sake.
Can I just check, trying to remember your chronology, was there actually a gap after EdSat 2 was shut down before you were actually offering a service on the Atlas? We completely...
No, not nearly. We were in danger of that, and the temporary supervisor avoided that danger. But yes, when EdSat 2 closed down, we only had the temporary supervisor and an autocode compiler. So it was a bit dodgy, in terms of public relations. But within a year, we had the main system. And within another year, we had time sharing. Of course, time sharing saved our bacon.
Sorry, I have a question following on from the need to document and save things. What happened to Peter Swinnerton Dyer's software?
Well, it's probably in a file somewhere in the master computer lab, written in his handwriting still. And all of a sudden, his stuff is remarkable. He's a funny
Worth preserving, I think.
Absolutely. But there's a lot of archive material in the computer laboratory which no one's dealing with. Because when they moved to their spanking new Will Gates building a few years ago, it all got dumped in a nice, fresh place, but it was still a dump of files. And Karen Needham, Karen Spell-Jones and I got very worried about this, and we started a project of trying to do the archiving. But neither of us are archivists, and we tried to get the local librarian to do something about it, but he didn't. So it's just still there, untouched. And but it needs looking at. It is not just Titan. There's the whole of the archives of the MASNAP, and there's an awful lot there. There are boxes full of mathematical tables from Jeff Miller. Boxes and boxes of them.
Any more? No? All done? No?
Dan Hayton, a very late comer into the computer business with the IBM 360. But in my career, I worked on the IBM System 38 and AS 400, which is also a single-level storage machine. Were there any connections? Was somebody from IBM sort of looking at it and thinking that's a good idea, we'll put it in future system? Any of that?
IBM, if you go to IBM and ask that question, they will credit Atlas.
Yeah.
And they're not Titan, Atlas, because Atlas with the one-level store
Yeah.
was seen by the rest of the world. In fact, it was sadly at John Fairclough's memorial service. Someone in a speech, I think it was probably Fred Brooks, I don't know, said that John Fairclough, because he was a Brit but he worked for IBM, and in the 60s he was on the 360 development team, and he was seconded out to the States to be on that team. And he took with him British technology, and he said to all the IBMers in Yorktown, in White Plains, wherever, there's some good ideas over there, we should adopt them, and they did. And that was very much due to John Fairclough, and Atlas figured greatly in that. But it was an Atlas influence, not a Titan one.
Any more? No. Shall I pass it back?
Yes. Okay, thank you. Well, can I, on behalf of everybody, thank David, Richard and John for their contribution. It's been an interesting afternoon, and I'm sure it's brought back very many memories for all of you here. Can I remind you that the next meeting is October the 18th, when Hamish Carmichael and friends will be talking about some CAFS applications, and we look forward to that. The next meeting after that is after Christmas. It will be January the 17th, when we have a joint meeting with the Electronic Publishing Specialist Group on the origins and the development of electronic publishing, and that will be given by David Penfold, David Brailsford and Conrad Taylor. And I've seen one or two clips, video clips and so on from Conrad Taylor, which I gather he was planning to use that afternoon, and it does look as though that will be a fascinating introduction to the whole history of electronic publishing. So anyway, can I look forward to seeing everybody at those two events, and conclude by inviting you to thank David, Richard and John for this afternoon. Thank you very much.